Hello everyone and welcome back to yet another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys for tuning in. Happy Wednesday, happy hump day everybody. We should have a fantastic show ahead for you guys. Similar to yesterday's show, a couple more betting odds I'm going to present to you, a couple more IDP player profiles along with that as well. It should be a very well-rounded show. We'll start off with the world of football, the updated Super Bowl odds. Is anyone going to challenge that duopoly at the top of the Chiefs in the AFC and Niners in the NFC? Then we'll look at the World Series odds as well. Very even top 5 teams in terms of betting odds. And then, of course, we'll round it out with a couple of defensive player profiles. But before we begin with all that, I do want to remind you, as always, at the beginning of these shows, to like, follow, and subscribe to all the shows on our network and the network as a whole. It is greatly appreciated by all. Plus, we do receive a ton of tips and donations, so if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving them at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole. But without further ado, let's jump right into our first segment of the day. It should be a tasty one. We are going to the world of football, but not in a way that you think. We're not starting off with player profiles. We are starting off in the world of betting odds, in the world of making futures bets, so to speak. With the updated Super Bowl odds for the upcoming season, it is fast approaching, and I want to keep you guys as updated as humanly possible before you make any decisions concerning which team you are going to bet on, if you do bet on the Super Bowl. Without further ado, let's look at the top 10. I think I'm going to break this into groups of 2 teams because there are a lot of similar teams in this list. There are a lot of teams that I want to give extra attention to maybe because they weren't this high last year. But overall, it's a very exciting list. And let's start off with the bottom 2 teams here. 2 teams that actually played each other last year with a very interesting result. The Cowboys and the Packers both at 18-1 odds. Not too long odds, but 2 teams that have not had the playoff success that you would expect of them. Obviously, the Packers last year were a much changed team, much revamped team. New look at quarterback with Jordan Love. Very, very weird receiver room where there was no clear number 1. And then look at the Cowboys, who always seem to fall up short in the postseason, and they played each other. The Packers blew away the Cowboys at their place in AT&T. And so, looking at these 2 teams, I think the Cowboys deserve to be a bit lower, actually. I don't think they're both on level terms because the Packers right now are one of those interesting teams that, while they don't necessarily have the high-profile players of other teams in this list, they're very well balanced. And Jordan Love seemed to be very composed last year, in terms of knowing that he doesn't have the number 1 guy, but that he can rely on everyone. It's an every man for themselves kind of offense, distribute the wealth, and it showed last season in the postseason. They were very close to knocking out the 49ers as well on the road. So this Packers team is set with the Cowboys. I really think of them as one of those teams that needs to let go of their stars. Dak, I believe, has done all he can for the city of Dallas. I don't necessarily see him maintaining a deep playoff run this year. I don't necessarily like the receiving core outside of CeeDee Lamb. Brandon Cooks is getting older. I like Luke. I like Ferguson in the red zone, but I don't see him as a blocking, all-around, seamless tight end who can make plays in the open field. But when it comes down to the eye test, let's say, I think the Packers pass it more than the Cowboys. They're a younger, more upside-heavy team, and right now, I feel like Matt LaFleur is comfortable with not necessarily deeming anyone to be my wide receiver 1 or my star player, because it really allows these young players to buy into the culture they're creating. So those 2 teams, I think, are heading in drastically opposite directions. And I would not be surprised if this is Dak's last year in Dallas. Let's switch to the middle tier here. We have the Texans at 16-1 and the Bills at 15-1. This also seems like a very weird pairing where the Texans could be higher than the Bills because they're also in the same boat as the Packers. They don't necessarily have a star number one receiver. Nico Collins could become that this year, and I really like what Tank Dell and Noah Brown, and they also brought in Stephon Diggs. Let's not forget about him. They're just a very well-rounded team. They did add stars, so hopefully that dynamic is not ruined between what C.J. Stroud and his other receivers have already built. But Stephon Diggs definitely gives you that verticality, that experience, that route running ability. And then you add Joe Mixon in the backfield, who adds that physicality, who has that explosivity. He's going to be very integral in how they play early downs. And I really like the Texans. And they could and should, in my humble opinion, be above the Buffalo Bills at 15-1 here because of the fact that the Bills don't necessarily have the number one receiver anymore. Obviously, if they get Brandon Ayuk, that's a different question. But right now, Keon Coleman's unproven. Khalil Shakir and Curtis Samuel are wide receiver 2s at best. And I really think they need to lean more on what they did to get into the playoffs in the first place last year, where you just have to shorten the passing game and make it more James Cook oriented. Because that's the only way I see the Bills deserving of a place above these young, hungrier teams on this list. And so I would say the Texans are a safer bet out of the AFC to challenge that duopoly at the top than the Bills. Then you go to teams like the Bengals and Lions and Eagles. Bengals at 13-1, Lions and Eagles at 11-1, who are all really in that 1A kind of group trying to break through in their respective conferences. For the Bengals, it's all about Joe Burrow's health. If Joe Burrow stays healthy, he is at the very least the third or second best quarterback in the AFC. And it really rejuvenates that team because last year, obviously, Jake Browning had a couple good games as his replacement. But at the end of the day, the Bengals start and go with Joe Burrow at the QB position. If Joe Burrow is healthy, I see the Bengals making it all the way to the AFC Championship. Because I think that at this moment, I would still say they're better than the Texans. That could change in 2 to 3 years. But it's all about maintaining the integrity of what they built. Obviously, T. Higgins is a little bit upset. He's going to test free agency. Perhaps at the end of the year, he's on a franchise tag now. But I still think they have a solid group to build around. You obviously have lost Boyd, but you still have Jamar Chase. You have an interesting crop of young receivers to build around should T. Higgins leave. And then you look at the Lions and Eagles, who both could interchange. These are both, at the very least, NFC Championship contenders. They're going to challenge that 49ers squad very heavily. I like the Lions. They just have to get out of their own heads. Dan Campbell especially, because his play calling is what's going to be integral. Obviously, Ben Johnson does an incredible job of running that offense, but it all comes down to what Dan Campbell's decision-making brings out of it, because if he keeps making these very, very important decisions like he did in the NFC Championship game and they fail, then who's to say the Lions will be out earlier than people think? They established themselves last year as a team to be reckoned with, but in order to maintain that, sometimes you got to play the game the way it's meant to be played. Sometimes you got to play safe. And I don't know if Dan Campbell is ultimately capable of that just yet. I like the system. Jared Goff looks the most comfortable he's been. Amon-Ra St. Brown is a wide receiver 1, first team All-Pro all day. I really love what he's done with that team. Their defense is rounding into form. I have questions about their secondary, but their front 7 is very potent. I love Aiden Hutchinson. I love what they're doing up there. I love their offensive line. So all those things need to come together around a plan that Dan Campbell can get behind without risking them being out earlier than people expect. And then when we get to the Eagles, I think the Eagles are a weird team because they seem to have this sense of dominance, but I kind of feel like they're rebuilding and retooling as well. More so retooling, but right now, I can see how people consider them a Super Bowl contender. If Jalen Hurts kind of gets back to what he was doing in his MVP caliber season when he got to the Super Bowl, if A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith can really help him and elevate him again, if the secondary behind an aging Darius Slay and a couple other pieces like C.J. Gardner-Johnson, Reed Blankenship can really coalesce, then this team might kick into gear because I really like what Nick Sirianni's doing. I think the Eagles can progress, but it's all about what phase they believe they're in. They can go all in, but they also need to sit back. And then, outside of them, you have the top three of the Ravens at 10-1, the Niners at plus 600, and the Chiefs at plus 550. And looking at the Ravens, they were just a game short of going to the Super Bowl for the first time in the Lamar Jackson era. They add Derrick Henry to the backfield, maybe to add more volatility to the way they approach the run game because it seemed to be a more running back by committee approach. But they add Derrick Henry to add more physicality, more grit perhaps. They still have Zay Flowers, Mark Andrews. If he's healthy, he's always going to be one of the better receivers or tight ends in the NFL. So the Ravens are ultimately in that kind of conversation to challenge the Dwap. But then the 49ers and Chiefs are the creams of the crop. The 49ers, best skill position talent in the league. Regardless of whether or not Brandon Ayuk leaves, they still have Debo, George Kittle, Jawan Jennings is a nice little option, and Brock Purdy is a steady presence. We'll have to see how he does without certain weapons, should they get injured as the year progresses. But what we've seen from him shows that he can be a competent, capable quarterback. And then, of course, the Kansas City Chiefs. When you have Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce, you got to be the number one team in terms of Super Bowl betting odds. You add Marquise Hollywood Brown, Xavier Worthy, the speed, the verticality, Rashee Rice rounding into a fantastic receiver, savvy route runner, fantastic hands that he showed in the Super Bowl. So ultimately, I am not mad that these two are at the top because they have the best skill position talent. They have the head coaches in both Kyle Shanahan and Andy Reid who are ambitious. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I can see a world where we get a third straight Chiefs 49ers Super Bowl. But that would just about wrap up this updated Super Bowl odds segment. Coming next, we transition to our first IDP player profile segment of the day with a young man in the New York Jets who's going to wreak havoc on opposing defenses for years to come now that the Jets are building and rounding to form in terms of their defensive prowess. You don't want to miss that segment when we come back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind, 'cause every